Hello and welcome to Varn Vlog. Today I'm going to talk about immiseration, one of the most difficult parts of Marxism. Something that Marx got wrong in his own lifetime. I mean, he thought the immiseration of the working class in the 1850s would lead to an immediate revolution. It did not. This led him to correct a lot of things in Capital. And I think we have to deal with two different catastrophist visions of Marx. There's a catastrophist vision based on Capital Volume 1 of absolute immiseration of the working class leading to working class rebellion and violence. And there is the other catastrophist interpretation based off volume 2 of Capital and volume 3 about the decline of the rate of profits causing a profitability crisis due to overproduction that would collapse the capitalist system. Though the former is associated with early Marx and is considered debunked, and the latter is associated with people like Heinrich Grossman and Paul Maddox Sr., and is almost impossible to debunk because of the countervailing tendencies thesis, but people have tried. You can read Andrew Kleiman's work on Grossman for an example of a debunking. I don't think it's totally fair to Grossman, but nonetheless, it's there. What Sam Badger did in his Misunderstanding Marx and Immiseration Substack, which I will link in the show notes, is try to revive an understanding of immiseration based in Marx's work in Capital Volume 1, particularly in chapters 10 and chapters 25. So you can go check the chapters if you wish. That made immiseration something that was social and psychological as well as economic, so it deals with all three domains of society, and that it is a relative, not absolute immiseration. All right. And that this relative immiseration and its attendant sociological effects would be true regardless of if wages do not hit the same as subsistence or absolute poverty as defined by the poorest places of the world, etc., etc. Now, I'm not sure I find Sam's argument totally persuasive about this attempt to save immiseration, but it is a reading that is rooted in the text and is justifiable, so we're going to talk about it here. Badger explains that many critics, and we'll talk about those critics a little later, and even many supporters of Marx mistakenly believe that Marx predicted absolute immiseration. And I do think early Marx did, because I've read his letters about it about the 1850s. And what was absolute immiseration? The idea that wages would eventually drop below subsistence levels, causing a revolution out of the necessity of survival. What Badger argues is that Marx was actually talking about relative immiseration, that even if the workers' real wages increase, they can buy more goods. Their position relative to capitalists worsen because the share of value going to the worker decreases, while the share of capital, the basis for profits, increases. Now, one thing you're going to have to try to do to square this away with Marx's whole oeuvre is try to figure out how this squares with the declining rate of profit tendency, which is not an absolute thing in Marx. It's called the law of a tendency, which is its own semantic debate I'm not going to get into today, but it is something that you have to deal with when you're arguing about relative immiseration, because profits declining and wealth increasing, as well as the social power associated with wealth for the bourgeoisie, is not obvious. I actually tend to think it's true. that in real commodities without rents or IP, there is a tendency of the profit rates to decline, as you see in commodities like steel or whatever, that are offset by other things being war, relative market capture, monopolies, monopsonies, etc. Um, but in general, look at the price of any real commodity that doesn't have a lot of IP involved, and you'll see its price decline over time. What distorts that, as far as our understanding of profits and rents are part of profits, uh, although we probably shouldn't see them as part of profits until you look at the general profit rate, not the specific profit rate, which we should probably, based on any industry, based on the actual amount of value accumulated in aggregate um, in that sector of the economy, and then look at what the difference per item is from what it sells and how much surplus value is captured versus cost, which a lot of those costs are going to be variable capital, which is labor, and fixed capital, which is automation, machine costs, etc. Now, that's again beyond the specter, the scope of Sam's essay. So, there's a general law of capitalist accumulation, which is not really the same thing as a profit rate, and that's important to note. The core of Sam's article examines Marx's general law from Capital Volume 1. Badger highlights that as capital accumulates, the social station of the worker declines because capital does represent social power. The work becomes more repetitive, specialized, and soul crushing. And immiseration, thus, is not just about the thinning out of the wallet, but a general decline in power. This is seen through three things: alienation, the worker losing control over the creative process through increased specialization, which, I have theories about increased specialization being a problem that have to do with complexity theory in addition to all of this, but I think this is generally true. Mutilation, the physical and mental exhaustion caused by modern industry, even in white-collar industries where that exhaustion has increased with AI, because, believe it or not, your productivity is expected to increase with the productivity enhancer. Now, does AI do it? Not really, but that is the goal. And then domination, the increasing power of machines and the employer over the individual's life, even outside of the workplace, through additional political influence, etc. Now, if this doesn't describe our world, I don't know what does. And Sam has a point here. The effects of immiseration relative to capital accumulation, and again, that's different from profit rates, is an effect that really would have sociological consequences and even physical consequences that aren't accounted for just by the subsistence theory of immiseration. And Sam's right. This is implicated, particularly in chapters 10 and 25 of Capital Volume 1. Another thing Sam Badger picks up on is the reserve army of labor, which is the unemployed. Now, we can get into the problems with the reserve army of labor versus the lumpen proletariat, because the lumpen proletariat is ill-defined, and the reserve army of labor is also kind of ill-defined. And in fact, one could quite believably think that Marx actually sees both as overlapping categories on a Venn diagram. But it's also important to take from Clive Burrow that neither the reserve army of labor nor the lumpen proletariat would be a clear class, because they don't have a coherent relationship to the mode of production, except maybe the reserve army of labor is excluded from it, but could potentially belong to it because it has the skills to be a worker. So there might be some way to talk about the reserve army of labor as a class, but really Marx doesn't talk about them as a class, but as a faction of the working class excluded from their function. Whereas the lumpen proletariat come from all strata of society in all classes. And he's got two different theories of what causes them, and I'm not going to get to them here because one of them is clearly wrong, which is that the lumpen proletariat is just the example of the classes left over in the transition to capitalism that have fallen out of favor and now exploit through direct criminality and domination the working class, while also being effectively part of it in its social strata, which means that it's a social category, not really a class in a proper Marxian sense, as Clive Borrow argues. I tend to use lumpenization as a verb, following Daniel Tutt, who also does the same thing. I don't know if I got it from Daniel, or if I came up with it concurrently to him, but we both think of lumpenization as a process. And we'll get back to that because I think lumpenization bleeding into particularly the blue collar, but now the white collar um, stratas of the working class makes a lot of sense. The habits associated with lumpen precarity, with people who don't have clear functions, actually would make sense under the immiseration thesis. So immiseration and lumpenization become related processes. This is not something Sam talks about. This is my interpretation of Sam, but we'll come back here. Sam also argues that immiseration is a social relation. The central point of his piece is that misery is a social category, not a biological or just an economic one. Badger argues that Marx views human beings as a creature with rich needs, and under capitalism, even if the worker is well fed, they are miserable because they are denied the ability to develop their full human potential, exercise autonomy, and live a life not dictated by the requirements of capital, and that capital holders increasingly have the power to shut them out from this due to their influence in the accumulation of wealth. Again, I can't emphasize this enough, but I'm going to emphasize it multiple times through this video. Wealth is not the same as profits, although profits generate wealth. All right. Badger concludes that arguing the death of Marxist theories has been prematurely declared by the rise of the middle class in the 20th century. One, the rise of the middle class in the 20th century happened under specific conditions. It happened to be, around the same time that the Soviet Union existed and capitalists acted all weird. But two, the social degradation and alienation have been increasing. And we see this in like the social profile. People have less friends. Technology dominates more and more elements of people's lives. Social spaces are more and more commoditized. You have to buy into them. And they're often now priced for the rich in the K-shaped economy, but it's been heading that way for a long time. Because of social degradation and alienation, and this being tied to a form of misery, thus immiseration, relative immiseration, not absolute, Badger suggests that Marx's critique remains highly relevant today, and I would agree with him. In fact, he goes on to say even workers with high salaries and thus high relative shares of their surplus often face burnout, lack of agency, and a sense of intimacy in their emptiness in their labor, and are often actually immiserated by automation when the variable capital is a little bit harder to push, and you can push AI onto very skilled workers and remove entry-level jobs and rote work, thus making your senior level people more productive, making them do more, while shutting out more and more people from this job, and also lowering wages for all kinds of fields. Data analysis, for example, was a high wage job not just 2 years ago, and it's declining pretty rapidly. Badger makes a good case that immiseration isn't just the prediction of a breadline. It's a system that makes the worker an appendage of the machine and subjugated by the bourgeois, stripping away their humanity, even if they produce an abundance of the commodities that stays with work. Now, there are some controversies that we can deal with around this. So I want to cover them. The controversies around Badger's article on about Marxist theory of immiseration involved deep disagreements over everything from history, economics, philosophy, and even the meaning of Marxist terms among Marxists themselves. This has to be acknowledged. To understand them, we need to look at the different schools that interpret the mechanics of capitalism. One, if we look at the absolute versus relative poverty debate, this is the most famous battleground in Marxist scholarship. There's the iron law of wages interpretation. Critics often link Marx to Ferdinand Lassalle's iron law of wages, which is, I think, wrong on so many levels, because if you read the Goethe critique and uh, the Gotha critique, and so many of Marx's letters about Lassalle, it's actually pretty clear that he hated the iron law of wages. But Lassalle's iron law of wages argues that wages should be pushed down to the bare minimum needed for the workers to stay alive and reproduce. If you take this view, Marx's theory was proven wrong by the 20th century's Great Compression, where the middle class exploded in relative wealth, particularly amongst the baby boomer generation in America and parts of Western Europe. Now, why the fuck would anyone actually link Marx's immiseration theory to the iron law of wages when Marx specifically wrote against the iron law of wages many times in his late work, and it's not mentioned in Capital, although Lassalle did seem to think it was there? I don't know. But that was a common interpretation of immiseration, and there is some evidence that early Marx, prior to the mid 1850s, did believe something like this in his letters. If we look at the relative share interpretation, if the workers' productivity goes up 100%, but their wages only go up 20%, they have been immiserated in a relative sense. We see this all the time. The power to influence society and their share of the social product has shrunk relative to the overall social product, which means that more surplus goes to the top. Now, what I have to square away here is I don't know how you square this with the declining rate of profits in Marx. I do think you can square it if you make a pretty strict separation between wealth and profits. Wealth includes also profits made in the past and accumulated over time. And so even if you look at, like, say, the wealth charts and look at the wealthy, you'll see, like, yes, the tech trillionaires are the wealthiest and they're relatively new to capital. But if you look at the Wichit's families, it's a very different deal. And it's not them, it's actually people who were the heirs of people who were strong in the mid 20th century during Fordism, whose wealth is still being circulated amongst now many individuals who had inherited that wealth. Now, the absolute versus relative poverty debate is, not an insignificant debate. It must be dealt with. And it's one that comes up quite a bit in anti-Marx scholarship. I mean, people like Karl Popper thought that basically the 20th century completely disproved Marx because there was no absolute immiseration during the 20th century. So there's that. So there are a few problems with Badger's argument, but I think Sam, in the main, has a point here that we just can't immediately discount. My problem with it is I don't know how to square it, like I said, with the tendency of the rates of profits to fall, because I do believe that accumulation increases over time. I do not necessarily believe that profits always do, unless those profits are subsidized by rents, which are themselves a form of profit in the overall profit matrix, but follow different rules. Rents, because they're a form of monopoly and enforced by the state, do not actually follow clean market competition and thus don't have the same pressures on pushing prices down. So there's that. There's also the qualitative versus quantitative debates, which Sam drags us into. Uh, is misery something you can measure with a calculator? Is this state of being? Is basically the fundamental question here. The quantitative argument is that real wages, wages adjusted for inflation, have increased. They point to the fact that today's poor have access to air conditioning, smart homes, and healthcare that even kings didn't have in 1867. Therefore, the theory of immiseration is dead, both to general social accumulation across the board and also in the fact that wages adjusted for inflation still have gone up. Now, I want to point out that wages adjusted for inflation haven't gone up as much as you think, and that, believe it or not, inflation was not common during the period Marx was writing in and is a more common thing in the 20th century and was controlled by various monetary elements after the Bretton Woods Agreement, both in relative pegs to gold and then later on through fiat currency and forex exchanges. Technologies that Marx, kind of understood and even wrote a little bit about, but did not go into any detail. And Marx is, dealing with fiat currency or state-backed currency. It wasn't backed by a commodity. It's basically non-existent. Although parts of the Grundrisse indicate that it was possible, he didn't think it was likely because he didn't think any one state would have the social power to enforce people outside of their state taking their currency. And that was probably true, actually, for, the 19th century. It's not true after the middle of the 20th, though. And here we are. And again, these are many, many debates you have to get into here. Now, Sam makes a qualitative argument. Badger emphasizes that Marx was talking about the degradation of the human being and the degradation of the worker. As work becomes more modern and managed, like of Amazon warehouse, worker tracked by algorithm, the worker loses their species being or self-essence. And that is a form of immiseration and general misery, while the accumulation gives the capitalist more power to enforce that, which I think is objectively observable. So, we can go about this. The problem that you're going to get, though, is skeptics will call Sam's whether humanistic reading is unfalsifiable. If the workers are happy with their jobs and their paycheck, a Marxist might have the claim false consciousness, and they are still miserable because they're alienated. But this is impossible to prove. Now, false consciousness, I think, is its own debate, and it's a word that I think has a defensible meaning, but most people use it poorly, particularly when it was invoked a lot about workers in the 1980s. And I think sometimes it's used as a get out of jail free card for when the workers don't do what you want. I'll probably have to do a video on false consciousness sometime and what I think is defensible about it and what I think hasn't been defensible about its uses. But it is true that if people say they're happy with the system, even if they're more immiserated, how do you square that? Because you have to claim that there's a consciousness that the worker's not aware of. And while there probably is a way in which the alienated worker is not aware of the class for itself and has to remain in the class in itself, to use these Hegelian categories, actually proving that's damn near impossible. There's also the immiseration versus consumerism debate, which is a debate I care less about, but let's get into it. This focuses on why the proletarian revolution hadn't happened in the West in specific. There's a couple of different theories as to why. When I cover and I do my series on the various forms of third worldism and why I don't discount third worldism, but wouldn't consider myself one of them. I think there's key insights in a lot of it, but I also think ultimately there's some holes in the theory that that don't cleanly demarcate on borders in a way that makes it as obvious as a lot of people want to make it. Some theorists believe that capitalism solved immiseration by turning the workers into consumers, thus providing cheap goods and credit. The system makes workers feel like they have a stake in capitalism. Even more so when you say that white-collar workers are often given 401ks and stock options, which literally make them micro-capitalists. They can't survive off of their capital gains, so they aren't truly capitalists. but they're invested into the system in a small way that would affect their future outcome and thus don't depart from it. This is kind of the bribe theory of consumerism. But there's a debt counter argument to this. Modern Marxists and some Immiserators will argue that this isn't the end of immiseration, but a new form of it. Instead of being physically starved, workers are immiserated through debt, which serves as social control and a limit on their ability to accumulate capital. They might have income, but they don't have wealth, because a lot of their wealth they can't accumulate because mortgages, student loans, etc., credit cards eat that up for them to be able to participate in the consumer economy. Thus, they remain wage slaves, not because they like bread, but because they are trapped in a cycle of working to pay off their interest on their basic elements of their lives, particularly when you think about medical debt and housing, things that aren't really things you can avoid and still live. This is kind of a convincing response to the bribe theory, if you think the bribe theory is just about cheap goods and consumer credit. Now, when you get into third worldism, which I'm about to talk about that, we'll get into that. Now, the debate centers on whether Marx's prediction comes true or not, but maybe not just in London or New York. Dependency theorists, which I've talked a lot about recently, may say that Badger is focusing on the psychological misery of Western workers, which ignores the absolute misery of the global South. They would argue that capitalism avoided revolution in the West by exporting the absolute immiseration, low wages, dangerous conditions, child labor, or even outright slavery to developing nations, just like it did in the colonial projects and the accumulation in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Is the immiseration of a factory worker in Bangladesh proof that Marx was right, or proof that Marx was wrong? Because Marx actually did not see the spatialization quite in this way. Or is it the fact that China has lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty through capitalist integration proof that he was wrong, since even though China has a command economy and can be argued to have a sense of history and thus a socialist mission, it did so by integrating into the global capitalist market to get the goods it needed to do development. Even if you don't think China is a capitalist system, you cannot deny that it had to turn away from Mao's go it alone, develop it within its own country approach that he maintained until his death. I know people don't like it when I talk about this, but you have to deal with it. I, for one, am a China defensist. I think there's plenty of people who think they're socialists in China. I also think that they command an economy, but for me to call it socialism is kind of a stretch. Although I guess you could say it's a socialist as the social democracies in Europe, but I don't consider those socialist either. So, nonetheless. So, we have to see, like, is any of this, the stuff in the developing world, although it's hard to call China the developing world when it's literally the manufacturer of the fucking planet with an ever increasing middle class. Although a middle class is kind of stalled out lately. We can get back to that. It is obvious to me that uneven development really does play a huge role in all this, and that may be the difference between relative and absolute immiseration. And maybe there is relative immiseration in the global north and absolute immiseration in the global south, but even that seems to be a little bit too easy. There are pockets of extreme wealth in the global south that also have white collar workers downstream of that. You can think about places in India. I think we need a very, very robust and complicated way of dealing with this. So let's talk about the last thing you could talk about, which is reserve army of labor in the gig economy. Marx predicted the law of general accumulation would create a permanent underclass of the unemployed and underemployed. The full employment critique. During the mid-20th century, many Western nations nearly had full employment, leading to critics say the reserve army was a myth. particularly during the height of Fordism. And we have relatively high employment now, but how we count employment's actually changed from how we counted it in the middle of the 20th century. And I think that's important for a lot of reasons. Um, but Badger and others point to the gig economy, Uber, Taft Raffet, freelance contractors for everything, which get around formal contract benefits, as a modern reserve army. These workers aren't unemployed, but they have no benefits, no stability, and no power. The controversy is whether this new form of immiseration is just temporary or are a permanent part of the labor market. I actually think it's the norm historically. And I think it's actually misleading to call it the reserve army of labor. It is the immiseration of the working class to court, which is always in the time period that Marx was writing, the 19th century, often paid piecemeal in weird ways. Sometimes you wouldn't get your wages for several months, and you'd have to get paid on script until you got your wages, which means you were constantly depleting your wage. Other times you might get paid by the day. Formal benefits were basically non-existent until the 20th century and really are a product of the interwar and post-war period. These are things that really are relatively modern. Now, we can talk about a few theorists, and I like to tie these things into other theorists to give you a better scope of what's going on here. While Marx focused on the production side of misery, Veblen, an American institutionalist, focused on the cost of consumption. If Badger argues that misery is relative, Veblen might provide us a mechanism, which is a treadmill of status. As wealthy get wealthier, the baseline for a respectable life rises. Now, this is somewhat separate from any Marxist theory, and I think it's a little bit too easy to kind of claim that it is the same kind of thing, but maybe we should think about it here. Workers are miserable because they are forced into a pecuniary emulation, spending more than they have to maintain social standing, and it explains things like spending too much money on cars or clothing. This creates a cycle where real wages may rise, but the psychological stress and relative poverty increases because the gap between the worker and the elite remains unbridgeable. And this causes a lot of social tension because you really can't keep up with the Joneses when the Joneses are magnates of capital and have generational wealth. I find this, however, to be a little bit too psychological of a mechanism and actually doesn't explain everything that we see. That this may have made sense as a primary theory of social distinction during Fordism. It doesn't so much now. Relative wealth capture has gone through the roof during the neoliberal period of capitalism, which I date from roughly about 1976 to probably 2007 is like high period neoliberalism, and we're in some weird like transitionary period right now. But it's not dead yet. And I have a pretty rigorous definition of what neoliberalism is, which is not just laissez-faire markets, because it's never been that actually. It is governments using government fiat to create public-private partnerships where workers are removed from the pit table, unlike where they were included during Fordism. Unions were basically a third governing force, but also a real government of workers, which has been disempowered during neoliberalism. But also, you are forced into markets where gain is privatized, but loss is socialized. That's not true of very classical capitalism. While it's a myth that capitalism was ever without government interference, that's just always required banks and stuff to work. The extent of government involvement during neoliberalism didn't decrease, it increased. The amount of money going into the economy from the federal government increased. What decreased was how much of that was directly controlled by direct federal employment. So we should keep that in mind when we talk about what neoliberalism is. But during the neoliberalism period, wealth inequality has skyrocketed both in the developed world and outside of it. And if you remove China from the developing world indexes, the decline of real poverty also pretty much was really minimal. It happened, but like on margin, not a ton. Um, so what are we seeing here? I'd also like to introduce Henry Braverman's degradation of work. These theorists are the labor process theory. Sam Badger's point about the mutilation of the worker is best supported by him and Harry Braverman's 1974 classic, Labor and Monopoly Capital. Braverman updated Marx for the age of corporations and management, particularly for Fordist corporations and management. But I think it's important to note because in some ways, Braverman is dated because he was writing about the conditions of Fordism at its end, just like Christopher Lasch and a lot of other people were, and thus tend to predict things in the future based off of Fordist assumptions, which were being undone shortly after he wrote the piece. But nonetheless, Braverman argues that scientific management taylorism systemically stripped knowledge away from the worker and gave it to the manager, which increasingly became a larger and larger portion of capital. Braverman really picks this up and develops this, and it's kind of separate from, like, say, Burnham's managerial class or Ehrenreich's rebranding of that as a PMC. This was specifically a kind of immiseration through de-skilling, that even high-paid software engineers and nurses can be immiserated if their job is broken down into timely, mindless, algorithmically monitored tasks, which rob them not only professional autonomy, but also any ability to replicate themselves outside of that job. Their life is too specific. Then there's, of course, my least favorite theory of about 15 to 20 years ago, the great precariat theory by Guy Standing. If you want to look at the reserve army of labor in modern context, Guy Standing's theory of the precariat is probably the go-to framework. It's also a problematic framework because everything in it can be explained by classical Marxism, and you didn't need a weird category to do it. But that's just me. Badger mentions the precarious nature of work. Standing argues that we have a new global class that doesn't suffer from low wages, but a lack of the 7 labor securities: job security, health security, income security, recognized status, and so on. While this is true, I'd like to point out that most of that was also true of every proletariat in the 19th century. The precariat is just a proletariat not in Fordism. So it's kind of a reversion to the norm, and thus you don't need a new category for it. If immiseration isn't defined by the absence of good, but the absence of a clear future and social investments and reproduction and power associated with that from wealth accumulation, then precariat lives in a state of permanent chronic anxiety, which aligns perfectly with the idea that immiseration is a psychological and social condition rather than just a caloric one, which is fine, but again, not necessary. The precariat, to me, is a redundant category. We can talk about the hedonic treadmill if you really want to, which is a psychological theory. To tackle controversy of why welfare workers are still unhappy, you can bring the hedonic treadmill into the equation, which is, I think, another psychological theory, which might explain individual unhappiness, but doesn't really explain class-based anything. After all, the hedonic treadmill should apply more to the bourgeoisie than it does to the relatively well-off workers, and yet it wouldn't. But anyway, this explains why the absolute increases in wealth don't fix the relative misery as a basic psychological condition in almost a transhistorical sense. A person makes more money, their expectations and desires rise in tandem, resulting in no part of gaining happiness. In a capitalist framework and the system designed to constantly manufacture new needs through advertising, the worker is kept in a state of permanent subjective immiseration. Thus, the hedonic treadmill increases. My issue with this is kind of obvious. The hedonic treadmill would apply to everybody, not just the worker. And this brings me to the last one, which is David Graeber's bullshit jobs. The greatest short essay that should have never been made into a book because Graeber was too against actually doing empirical research to actually justify his goddamn claims. And I read the book. Don't come at me. That justifies his claim. His categories don't even make sense. But anyway, I think the bullshit jobs thing is actually, his attempt to explain the PMC and a bunch of other stuff by just saying that this was a form of social control through wages. Um, so it's highly relevant to alienation, but Graeber is trying to deny the category of alienation in a different way than, say, the Althusserists are trying to deny a category of alienation. Basically, because Graeber doesn't like Marx. I mean, he does, but he doesn't. He pulls a lot from Marx, but in weird ways. The connection is that Marx argued that the workers alienated from their own activity. In many ways, have actually talked about the alienation in at least 4 ways in the early economic and political manuscripts: alienation of self, alienation from the work process, alienation from society, and alienation from other workers. These are all implied in the early writings on alienation. So I often refer to it to the fourfold alienation, which is to separate that alienation from other forms of psychological alienation, like the subject-object alienation, etc., which are implicit to all of existence, and sometimes people confuse them. All right. Graeber looked at further by looking at jobs that served no purpose at all, but were highly relevant to social control, except that Graeber doesn't often prove that these jobs serve no capitalist purpose. He actually has some kind of ideal working state where, certain things happen for only social goods, and thus, many bullshit jobs are actually just ways of extracting value, which means they're not bullshit at all. And his theory that this is mainly about social control through wages is even weirder when you look at that. I'm not going to go into all the problems with the bullshit job thesis. I think they are many and manifold, and I think alienation gets at the same thing better, but of course I would. Graeber argues that millions of people perform bullshit jobs like middle management, corporate lawyers, PR manufacturers, because they themselves believe are useless. This is a form of spiritual immiseration. Earning a high salary while feeling your existence contributes nothing to the world, which is a profound social degradation. The problem is that a lot of these jobs actually do produce things that produce surplus value, meaning our rents, or one of the two, meaning that they make total sense on the capitalism, and you should shut the fuck up. And a lot of the other ones are necessary because of forms of intercapitalist competition or state compliance. They're not bullshit, meaning they have no function. But the conditions in which they put people in probably are highly alienating for a variety of reasons, and this relevant since Badger explores, and thus Badger's relative immiseration probably is a better theory than bullshit jobs. All right. Now let's talk about each of these theories' conflict with Marx. Marx believed that the workers were driven by necessity and exploitation. Veblen argues they are driven by social status because everyone is driven by social status. Marx might argue that Veblen's focus is too much on the psychology of the consumer and not enough of the power of the owner and the role of production. And you wouldn't even necessarily say that Veblen was wrong. I always flip that. Sorry. There's a couple other problems with it. One is it's sheer elitism. Veblen's theory is patronizing, suggesting that poor people are just mimicking the rich rather than making rational choices. I do think mimicking the rich is sometimes a rational choice, so I'm not going to say Veblen was completely wrong here. But the other thing is status is increasingly hard to mimic. Many status symbols like social media are free, which complicates the idea that status seeking always leads to financial misery or even financial competition. Status seeking has all kinds of variables, and Veblen may have realized that, and so may Marx, but it doesn't explain class distinction. Let's get to Reverman's degradation of work. Reverman was one of the most orthodox Marxists on the list, although how orthodox is debatable. He takes his Marx ideas on descaling and proves that using modern capital management would increase this through Taylorism. The problems is there's an upskilling counter argument that argues that technology actually requires more skills, not less. A software engineer needs more specialized knowledge than a 19th century weaver. The problem I have with this is specialized knowledge is not transferable. So while you might be hyper skilled in one area, you're only hyper skilled in one area. And this is actually the reason why I bring in Joseph Tainter's complexity theory on specialization in particular when I talk about this, because when you look at that, some of Marx's assertions still make sense, even though Marx doesn't frame things in terms of complexity at all. Another thing that Braverman might be accused of is not dealing with workers' agency. Braverman is often criticized for painting workers as passive victims. In reality, workers often find ways to reskill themselves or resist management's attempts to simplify their jobs. We might call this the medicine cunning argument. And I think this might be true in the individual case, but there's a hard evidence for it in the overall case, as de-skilling seems real when you look at almost every form of literacy, from media literacy to technological literacy, et cetera, et cetera. Almost everything you have automates something for you, removes a form of literacy from you, and increases your dependence on the technology. Sorry. Doesn't mean the technology is bad either. I don't even have to talk about the precariat because I already did, but basically, Marx saw the proletariat as a unified force that eventually gained power. Standing argues that the precariat is too fragmented, angry, and unstable to lead revolution. Basically, that they're lumping. They lack class consciousness because they are too busy surviving day to day. Well, the problem with that is that was always fucking true of the proletariat. I don't know what your problem is, Standing. You could just read a book about the 19th fucking century. But anyway, sorry. Critics argue precariat isn't a new class at all, but just a working class returning to its unstable state after a brief anomaly of 1950s post-war middle class boom that we now call Swordism in America and social democracy in Europe. Because the precariat is driven by anxiety, they're just as likely to support populism or far right movements as they are to support socialist ones. But that's also probably true of any precaritized or lumpenized working class. Remember the concerns about the lumpen in Marx. The hedonic treadmill I've already dealt with. Basically, it applies to everybody, so you can't use it to explain a class phenomenon. While Graeber's argument perfectly illustrates the concept of alienation, Graeber doesn't believe in the concept of alienation. So you can't use it that way. So while I think some of Graeber's research actually is perfectly considerable with Marxist fourfold alienation, it's not something Graeber himself would have accepted. Problems, though. Traditional communists argue that bullshit jobs shouldn't exist in the free market. Why would a profit-seeking capitalist pay someone to do nothing? They argue that jobs must provide some value or some compliance function that Graeber just doesn't see, and I can actually find that in many of the examples Graeber gives. 2, the theory relies on whether or not workers feel their job is useless, not whether or not the job is actually useless to producing surplus value. I mean, I feel many things I do is useless on a day-to-day basis, but I still do them. Like, there are days where I feel like eating is useless, and it clearly isn't. So, there you go. If an office worker likes their bullshit job because it pays well and is easy, does this theory hold that it's bullshit if you're going off of how workers feel? All right. We can look about this last trait, though, because it comes up in Badger and in Graeber and a lot of other places really clearly. The feeling of being drained by pointlessness, kind of spiritual violence or psychological violence of a job that doesn't need to exist or does need to exist, but something that you don't benefit from, is a uniquely modern form of immiseration. It suggests that while we have solved many of the physical miseries of the 19th century, we've replaced them with a psychological vacuum. I actually don't think we've solved all the things of the 19th century. The 19th century seems to be coming back in full force, motherfuckers. But nonetheless, for a while we did. We can wrap this up by looking at the pointlessness of modern work, which creates a conflict between traditional economic view and something like this new Marxist view that Sam Badger is defending. Why does pointless work still work? If a job is truly useless, why does the system keep it? This is where the theories of alienation and managerialism provide some insight. One, the managerial feudalism argument, which I don't really believe, but we should consider, and it's one promoted by Graeber. In a traditional factory, you weren't producing a widget; you were a cost to be cut. But in the modern corporate capitalism, any bullshit jobs stood as status symbols for the higher ups, at least according to David Graeber. The logic, just as the middle lord had servants to show his importance, a modern executive has creative directors, assistant vice presidents, and strategic consultants to signify their power within the organization. Although if they weren't important, why did they need to reduce them with AI? That's all I have to say about that. It seems obvious to me. For the worker, the misery here comes from knowing that their work is a performance rather than a contribution. This is the ultimate social degradation Sam Badger mentions, being reduced to a prop in someone else's status game. The problem with this is that there isn't a lot of evidence that these just exist to promote someone's ego, and it's even more unfalsifiable than the things we've accused Marx of being unable to falsify. The precarity of the office cog. Even if a job is pointless, it isn't easy. Modern workers are often kept in a state of high anxiety via performance metrics, which I think this is true. If you don't actually produce a physical product, the company has to invent ways to measure you. Key performance indicators, engagement scores, et cetera, et cetera. And you even see this replicated in education. I even have a fucking engagement score in my job. Anyway, this creates a world where you are working incredibly hard to satisfy an algorithm or a metric that you know is probably meaningless or impossible to meet. This is a form of relative administration in action. The capitalists extract your time and energy. In return, you get a paycheck, but you lose a sense of self-worth. But I have to say that this isn't really what Sam is talking about. Sam is talking about something deeper than this, and I think we have to look at it. It's about relative social power and the fact that your job may be necessary, but you are removed from its product so thoroughly that you get no benefit of seeing your work completed. And that's true for the manufacturer as it is for the office worker. If we follow Sam Badger's logic, the death of Marxism was declared because workers started getting air conditioning and TVs. At least according to Karl Popper and Hayek and a bunch of other people that I'd rather not mention, but have to. But if those same workers are now spending 40 hours a week in a state of bullshit boredom and high stress, relatively pointless jobs from their own perspective, has the system actually improved their lives? No, it hasn't. Furthermore, the relative power of the capitalist in terms of their holding of accumulated wealth has just increased astronomically. So your ability to leverage any wealth gains against this is almost impossible. If we connect pointless work to relative immiseration, there is a widening gap between the immense productive power of society and the actual quality of workers' lives that people particularly feel right now. And many of the benefits that they've been promised in the past, which clearly there's a wealth for, have been captured by the accumulation of wealth equaling more power for the capitalist. This is a kind of proof of this relative immiseration thesis, even if some of it doesn't completely work out with all of Marx in my head. In Sam Badger's piece, relative immiseration isn't just about the paycheck. It's about the workers' diminished standing in the world that is supposedly getting richer and more advanced, while they have less skills, less wealth relative to overall wealth, and less ability to function. And there is a real sense in which the costs of even necessities like healthcare and housing are becoming unattainable. Marx argued that as technology, constant capital, fixed capital, you hear it translated as both, improves, the amount of labor needed to the same society would decrease. It decreases socially necessary labor time. MMTers post-Keynesians like Steve Keen would argue that Marx didn't think that technology contributed to the production of value. Marx didn't, but he did think that it made the production of value easier because it reduced socially necessary labor time. If we all produce everything we need in 4 hours, but the system forces us to work 8 hours, we can fill the extra 4 hours with bullshit tasks or administrative bloat. This is a form of immiseration. And it's one that can be easily cut off, and maybe now is being cut off. The thing with bullshit jobs is we all know that most jobs aren't bullshit, but we know that parts of them are. I have to do things about compliance or to meet my boss's expectations that do not contribute to overall society in any way. Now, I am not a productive worker in either the white collar or blue collar sense. I am a state worker who lives off relative property taxes as a form of my wage. So I don't know that I factor into this in the same way, nonetheless. Society is about 10 times more productive than it was 50 years ago, but the workers' social reward, free time, autonomy, and security has stayed flat or declined since the 1980s, and that is an undeniable fact. The misery is distorting potential of what life could be versus what it is when all this power is accumulating to individuals who just want to make you rentiers, or rent payers, really, not even rentiers. Relative immiseration workers' power compared to the capitalist. In the office, a worker may have a high salary, but their job may be pointless. They have zero leverage over what the function of their job is. A craftsman, a skilled engineer in the 19th century had workplace power because they knew how to make things as a whole process, but they didn't do it efficiently. And thus the paradox of modern production, increasing efficiency, breaking skills down into chunks, but as chunks break down, at first you skill more and more of the workforce, then you de-skill them. In modern manager, a data scraper is easily replaceable by AI or anyone else because the role is a product of corporate bureaucracy, not an essential social need. It is, however, a need of capitalists, either for legal fiat, because they have to maintain certain legal controls, or because it brings in relative profit value somewhere. So there you go. We should keep those things clear because what is productive for capital and what is productive to social needs has never been the same thing. The relative salaries drops because they're entirely dependent on the rim of the hierarchy, which doesn't really need their specific labor the function. They can replace it because that highly skilled, highly trained, highly specific thing, once it is automated, it's a lot less useful. Relative immiseration in the 21st century may look like many things. You may have a good job and you may be able to buy nice things for credit, but you spend 50 hours a week doing things you find meaningless to pay off a mortgage on your house that you're too tired to enjoy, and where your kids aren't likely to get it unless they inherit it. The concentration of the capital reached levels unseen even in the Gilded Age. The gap between a day-to-day job and the actual technology capacity of humanity, as Immiseration Marx predicted, at least according to Sam Badger, and I think is justifiable. The pointlessness comes from alienation and relative immiseration and your inability to understand the entire process of which you are only a cog. We have to look at the gap between what society could provide and what the worker actually gets, and what the owner gets relative to everything else. We have a productivity versus leisure gap. Keynes and a lot of the Keynesians predicted that as productivity increased, we'd have more leisure, and the opposite has been true. Instead of giving time back to the worker as leisure, manager soaks up the time with excess procedural value, crying administrative bloat, middle management layers, bullshit tasks, as well as just more fucking work. And you get less of the economic dividend for it, even if your wages are higher. Your wages aren't going up with your productivity. So there's less leisure time and you're more productive. There's a loss of functional power both politically and in your daily life. When a job seems pointless because you're alienated from its results, or it seems subordinate to some really arcane social product that maybe produces more value for the company, but you don't see any of it, the worker has zero leverage. They're dependent on the whims of a corporate bureaucracy whose ways of measuring them is unclear to everybody and probably somewhat arbitrary. Now, we should look at three things when we address relative immiseration: stolen time, stolen agency, and stolen potential, which are all from the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a very few through the amassment of profits on the backs of specialized and unspecialized labor. At the end of the day, that's still true. On that note, protect your peace. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell. You can find more meandering video essays, lectures. I don't know what I'm going to call these things. They're not really video essays because they don't do the nice clippy thing. And they're not really lectures because they're kind of all over the place. But nonetheless, there'll be more of them. I'm also doing more focused ones. We still have a lot of episodes coming out on all kinds of topics, both socialist related and not. I'm going to be doing more historical episodes and whatnot. Those tend to be popular. I'm probably going to bring poetry back because I like it. You guys don't watch it. You always tell me you want to watch it. Then I look at the numbers and it's like, the poet people are like very loud, but very small. But I might do some more. I have a lot coming up and already pre-recorded. Some on ancient theories of materialism. Yeah. Some on other views of Marx's ethical demands. More stuff on popular and united fronts. Stuff on Cold War cinema. We got all kinds of interviews coming. Even some stuff on AI and the dead. So there's that. I'm gonna continue being diverse and hard to nicheify. It's probably not helped my growth, but nonetheless, it helps my conscience. And I hope you're all doing well. If you want to subscribe, I could use the help. I broke my foot. You can't see it because you only see me from here, but it's not fun. And update. As I continue to morph into a mountain man who, no matter how long my beard gets, my mustache will never touch it. I don't understand what that's about. But anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this. If you want more, and I do more of these behind the Patreon wall, you get subscribe to the Patreon for as little as $4. You'll get access to an archive of thousands of hours of me talking to other people, to myself, to the internet. It involves some things that are only on the Patreon, in addition to some shows that are mostly only on the Patreon, such as Parallax Vlog with JG Michael, where we talk about current events and movies. It's gotten weirdly specific because half the shows current events and half the shows us bullshitting about pop culture. I don't know what that's about, but it's people like it. There's diving into the wreckage. And there's some other series, like some stuff I'm going to be doing another series in brief with Daniel Tutt, and I'm doing a series with Brandon Lightly on specific topics. And there's also the Decadence series with the Regrettable Century brothers. So there's lots available both behind the Patreon and here free on the channel. I'm trying to provide 2 to 3 episodes a week. So hopefully you get that. I was overworking myself in the past, and I have spent time, instead of just reading material and doing Talmudic commentary on it, actually digesting and scripting things. And I hope you appreciate it. And don't forget, for free, there's also available on my Patreon for completely free self-study guides and reading lists and everything to teach yourself this on your own, or to set up a group of people, which is actually how I suggest you do it because it holds you accountable, and go through this and ask yourself some key questions and read some key texts and break down some theories. And you can set that up and do it on your own. I am probably going to offer a 4 to 6 session class over the summer on a topic involving Marx. And the Patreon subscribers will get a discount. I think it'll be like maybe $20 for them. And then everybody else will have like $40. I don't know. It's not going to be a lot of money. It's only going to be like 6 sessions over 2 weeks. In late June, when I don't have to do my day job. And there will be some engagements in the DC area, probably Baltimore too, that hasn't been set in stone yet, and New York, to promote a pamphlet / short book by Daniel Tutt and I on populism. That the ink is almost ready to be signed on the contract, and we have finished it for once. I'm talking about a book that I've actually, well, Daniel's made me really. Daniel is a very prolific writer and also very good at making me do stuff. Finished. So I hope you check that out. When it comes out, we'll be doing some stuff around it, both in person and here on the channel as well. But anyway, that ends the announcement. End of this. I've been traveling and I'm tired. And I hope you have a good day. Our next solo video will be finishing off our series on imperialism's early definitions with Lenin. And we're going to take a break and we're going to come back to it probably late this year, early next year, where I do mid 20th century Marxist and non-Marxist definitions of imperialism. And that's when shit gets complicated. But I'm going to have to do a lot more reading. Oh my God, so much reading. All right. So on that note, protect your peace, like and subscribe, hit the bell. There's a free podcast you can find on any place that serves fine podcast. Leave a review or a comment if you can't do monetary support. And remember, always keep fighting for the betterment of tomorrow. Take care.